All right, let's jump in. If you have a Bible, you can read along. Otherwise, the words will be up on the screen for you. This is Luke chapter 16. Jesus said, "There was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, and who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. As Lazarus lay there longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Finally, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried, and his soul went to the place of the dead. There in torment, he saw Abraham in the far distance with Lazarus at his side. The rich man shouted, 'Father Abraham, have some pity. Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm in anguish in these flames.' But Abraham said to him, 'Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted, and Lazarus had nothing. So now he's here, being comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides, there's a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over to you from here, and no one can cross over to us from there.' Then the rich man said, 'Please, Father Abraham, at least send him to my father's home. For I have 5 brothers, and I want him to warn them so they don't end up in this place of torment.' But Abraham said, 'Moses and the prophets have warned them. Your brothers can read what they wrote.' The rich man replied, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone is sent to them from the dead, then they'll repent of their sins and turn to God.' But Abraham said, 'If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead.'" I'm going to take by the utter silence in this room that this parable is interesting to you. We have spent the last 15 weeks, so probably almost a year ago, we sat down and sort of created a strategic plan for 2019 and what we wanted to focus on. And one of the things that we wanted to focus on were spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines. And so we plan to do a long stretch of sermons highlighting different spiritual practices of the Christian faith. But we wanted to do it in context. We wanted to talk about why these spiritual practices are so important. And that's because you and I are every day of our lives being shaped. There are cultural forces working on us in ways that cultural forces work on us. You can't see them. And oftentimes you don't know how to name them. And so you don't always understand the impact that they're having on your life. So we wanted to name them. What are some of the cultural forces that are just operating on us as people who live in 21st century America? There's nothing we can do about it. They're there, and they work on us every day. So the first one we lifted up was this value of progress. For the Christian person, when we talk about progress, what we're talking about is movement toward conformity to Jesus. So conformity to the person of Christ is the goal. It's the telos. It's where we're moving. That's how you know it's progress. We know where we're going. So when we talk about progress, if that's what we're talking about, then as a Christian person, that's good. But that's not often how we understand progress as Americans, is it? That progress for us is usually, it's more like this aimless pursuit of more stuff, more money, more whatever. That's bad. That shapes us in ways that we end up not looking so much like Jesus. We spent 5 weeks talking about this notion of freedom. So for the Christian person, true freedom, ultimate freedom is what I labeled as the capacity to do as we should. That you are freest as a human being when you can say no to the things that you ought to say no to and yes to the things that you ought to say yes to. But that's not how we experience freedom. as Americans. Freedom for us is typically thought of as just this unbridled ability to do whatever we want. And that has a way of shaping us. So over that sort of 10-week span, we talked about and introduced some practices that'll help us work against this force of progress as the aimless pursuit of more. Right? We talked about prayer and silence, slowing down, being quiet. We talked about Sabbath keeping, actually taking a day every week to stop doing stuff. We talked about fasting and simplicity. How do we sort of strip our lives down a little bit of the things that we think we need, but we don't actually? We spent a few weeks talking about practices that can sort of militate against this idea of freedom as the ability to do what we want. We talked about self-denial. What does that look like for the Christian person? We talked about what we do with our time and our money. So we spent a week talking about planning, how for the Christian person, we ought to sort of grab our schedules, our time, and ought to control that based on certain values. We don't just do stuff to do stuff, but we decide what we're going to do and why we're going to do it and when we're going to do it. We do the same thing with our money. We talked about tithing or giving, this practice that's supposed to shape us to understand that what we have is for the purpose of building community and helping people. Right? So this morning we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about another force that operates on us as people who just live in American culture, and we're naming it individualism. Right? That's the word that we're giving it. There are kind of two. So if you've ever had this thought, maybe you don't think this much, but if you've ever had this thought, what does it mean to be me? So who am I as a human person? There are sort of two ways of understanding human personhood that compete with one another, sort of on opposite poles. So on the one hand, you have what I'm going to call a collectivist vision or collectivism. So the way that a collectivist thinks about the human person is that you are just a social construct. You're just you're an amalgam of the values and the ideals of your community. So you were born and you live in a certain place, and what it means to be you is nothing more than the stuff that you've picked up along the way. There's nothing unique to you. You're just a puzzle of pieces. Okay? In a collectivist, like politically, the collectivist thinks about the group is more important than the individual. So the only value that an individual has in a collectivist worldview is in conformity or service to the collective. So you think about human society like a beehive. The beehive is what's important. The worker bees are not. The worker bees just serve the beehive, and that's their only value. So you see that fleshed out in actual political ideologies like fascism and socialism and communism. Okay? Ethically, the collectivist, ultimately, what the collectivist does, ethics become utilitarian. So we just try to do the greatest good for the greatest number, even if it means that you sacrifice the individual. Now, the purpose of this morning's message and the series that we're doing is not to sort of critique this, although I hope implicitly in some of the stuff that I tell you this morning, you're going to see that a Christian worldview militates against this idea, this perspective. On the other end of this spectrum is what I'll call the individualist vision or individualism. So unlike collectivism, what the individualist is going to say is, no, you're not a social construct. You are self-determined. Yeah, you've probably been shaped a little bit by your community, but ultimately you can transcend that shaping. You get to decide who you are. So not only do you shape your own life, but you can shape your own reality. You can shape your own truth. Politically, the individualist, where the collectivist says, the individual serves the collective, the individualist goes the other way. Right? It says, no, the collective serves the individual. So the only importance of the beehive is to make sure that I get some honey, even if that bee does not. Ethically, for the individualist, in the same way that A collectivist ethic eventually sacrifices the individual. So does the individualist. Eventually, if you lift up the individual so high, you have to say, my life matters more than your life matters. Now, let me be real clear. In the same way that a Christian worldview doesn't just broom notions of progress off the table, as if all talk of progress is just bad. And it doesn't broom all notions of freedom off the table. We were very clear about the ability to do what we want is an important aspect of freedom. It's just not the ultimate version of it. In the same way, Christianity does not broom off the table the value of the individual. I hope we all know that. One of the things that makes Christianity, in my opinion, ultimately believable and compelling, especially if you understand the historic context out of which it grew, is that Christianity places value on every individual human life. That every individual person is made in the image of God and is therefore intrinsically and equally valuable. So the Christian worldview places a very high value on the individual person, and not all faiths and worldviews do that. Now, having said that, in the same way that a Christian worldview is going to militate against a collectivist vision, it's also going to militate against this sort of individualist vision that I lifted up. That in American culture, one of our sacred values is the right of the individual. And as Christian people, we don't ever want to lose that. But what was originally meant to be a defense against or a bulwark against collectivism has in many ways become a defense or a bulwark against reality. That we have so highly lifted up the right of the individual that it has somehow morphed and metastasized. And culturally speaking, I'm sure that there are really smart people out there that could discuss how this happened. That's above my pay grade. You can just see it. You can just see this every day in your own life. That somehow our value of the individual and the individual's rights has been elevated so highly at the expense of the collective or the group that we've become a culture of anything goes, every man for himself, if it feels good, do it. What I believe is true simply because I feel it to be true or I want it to be true. Experts be damned, right? Kind of a almost solipsism where the only thing that matters is my own version of life and reality. We've literally made the equal but opposite error to the collectivist. So if the collectivist thinks that we can have a we without a me, the individualist, and this is the thing that I think we struggle with in American cultures, we think we can have a me without a we. That somehow my life as an individual person is kind of unrelated to your life. My happiness, my fortune, my comfort, and your comfort and your happiness or your security or your suffering, the fact that we're both humans on the planet, otherwise it's just unrelated. That we're all these sort of siloed people. So while Christianity is going to accept some notions of progress, but temper and critique it, and accept some notions of freedom, but temper and critique it, we're also going to accept some notions of individualism, that the individual life is intrinsically valuable. But a Christian worldview is also going to critique the way that we lift up the individual in our American culture. And the way that Christianity is going to do that, and this is sort of the thesis for this morning, is it's going to take the sort of collectivist value and the individualist value, and it's going to hold them together. What it's going to say is that you as a person, because you are made in the image of God, and God has a very specific nature, because you are made in the image of God, what it means to be human person is to be in indissoluble right relationship with other people. That's what human personhood is, and how human personhood servanthood develops and becomes. And I know that sounds heady, so let's just work the parable. You'll see how this plays out. Let's take a look at our rich man. The rich man in the parable that Jesus tells, let's view the rich man as the American individualist. This is a guy who, his worldview, he believes and finds it completely acceptable to pursue his own comfort, his own wealth, his own safety, his own security, his own fortune, irrespective of his relational context. Most conspicuously evidenced by the ridiculously poor person who sits at his gate every day. So this is a guy who thinks that his life and all of the stuff that's important to him is completely unrelated to that guy right there. My fortune, my comfort, my wealth, my security, my well-being, and your suffering are unrelated. So he has a worldview that makes that possible. That's the individualist worldview. Now, this guy would have been a religious man. It would not have made any sense for Jesus to tell a parable about a rich man who was not also part of their faith community, the people of Israel. So this guy has faith in Yahweh. He is a member of the people of God. But it's pretty clear from how the parable plays out that he has significantly misread his faith. Because both he and Lazarus die, and he ends up in this place called the place of the dead, which is not hell, by the way, but it's the place of the dead. And it says that he's suffering torment, and here's the thing, he's surprised by that. That all comes as a shock to him. He did not expect to end up here. That ought to tell you that his worldview, which included his faith in God, was misunderstood. He obviously misread what it meant to be a person of faith. He saw faith the way that I think a lot of us are taught to see faith, and that is it's just one more aspect meant to serve your personal well-being. Just like everything else in life, faith is meant to serve your personal well-being. Isn't that how many of you were taught faith? I mean, it wasn't taught to you in that language, because sort of once you say it like that, you go, but that doesn't sound right. But when you heard what we often call the Christian gospel, wasn't that kind of how it was served up to you? Something like, hey, buddy, you're in some serious trouble. But if you believe what I'm about to tell you, you can go to the good place when you die. Irrespective of what happens to anybody else around you, irrespective of what happens to your loved ones or that guy or the rest of the world, you as an individual person are in trouble. But here's this message we call good news. If you believe it, then you as an individual person, irrespective of anybody else, will end up in the good place when you die. That's how many of us initially receive faith. It is a proposal for your personal well-being. And that's how this guy clearly understands faith. Faith is just like anything else, right? It's like, my job or, my physical health and my relationships, like everything somehow comes back around to the way that this serves me and my well-being in the world. And you noticed that this was so deeply entrenched in his heart and soul that even in the place of the dead, while suffering torment, he doesn't get it. He can see Abraham. Abraham is the patriarch of the people of Israel. He's the guy that God initially established a covenant of grace and love with. He sees Abraham in the distance, and he sees Lazarus by Abraham's side, whom he calls by name. by the way. It's very odd for Jesus to name people in his parables. Lazarus gets a name, and the rich man knows his name, which means he knew exactly what he was doing when he stepped over this guy day after day after day. He sees Abraham off in the distance with Lazarus at his side, and you would think in that moment, while suffering pain and agony and seeing Lazarus, who you know, the guy that you overstepped every single day, you would think the light bulbs would come on and something like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Would start ringing, right? And you would go, Abraham, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what I was doing. I was so foolish. Please forgive me for the life that I lived. Lazarus, please forgive me for overlooking you. You would think that's what he would say. But you see, in his life, what was most important to him was his own comfort, security, well-being. And so in his death, all he cares about is alleviating his own suffering. And notice who he calls upon to serve him, to come alleviate his suffering. The very guy that he overlooked and refused to help every day of his life. How twisted is that? I mean, Jesus is such an amazing storyteller. You know, he gives you this image that the dogs come and lick Lazarus's open sores. You know, as sick and just the imagery there is so repulsive, but the saliva in a dog's mouth actually has healing properties. This is like Jesus' way of saying, the dog gets it better than you do. Right? The dog understands what it means to be a being more than you do. Lazarus, the rich man, just does not get it. This sort of individual faith is meant to serve my well-being has so distorted his understanding of what it means to be a God person that even in this post-mortem reality where his eyes are open now, he's seeing a reality that he couldn't see before. His heart is so distorted, so kind of subhuman that he still doesn't get it. Now you might point out, well, Mike, he does, he does, seem to have a heart for his brothers, right? I mean, doesn't that count for something? I mean, he's trying to look out for somebody. Yeah, I suppose. But before we go, lauding the rich man, notice he's still barking orders at Lazarus, right? It's still Lazarus who's going to serve his agenda. And he doesn't seem to be as concerned about what leads to you being in the place of the dead as much as just being in the place of the dead. And that is how faith serves a lot of people in an individualist worldview. It's not about being saved or rescued from. I use this as an illustration all the time. I was a terrible kid. And when my parents would go out or go to dinner or leave me unattended for more than a couple of hours, I was like the imperial dictator ruler, ruled with an iron fist. I would mistreat my siblings. We'd fight. Stuff would get broken. And when stuff like that would happen, my immediate impulse was never, oh my gosh, I really need to be saved from my wrong behavior. Right? It was never that. It was always, shoot, my parents are going to come home. What do I do about this? How do I hide this? All I care about as a kid is I want to get out of the consequences of my behavior. I'm not interested in actually being rescued from this sort of misshaped character that led to the wrong behavior in the first place. That's kind of what you see going on with the rich man begging for his brothers. It's not so much, look, I am jacked up and I'm cut from the same cloth as those 5 yahoos and they need some serious help. Please go and tell them what they've been doing so that they'll change the way that they live. It's just, I don't want them to end up in this place. So yes, he looks out for his brothers, and that's cool, but it still has this sort of individualist, what's going to be for my personal well-being kind of tint to it. Here's the thing. Abraham says to him, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to send, and this is Abraham's way of saying, this is not what your faith is about. You've misread it. You've misunderstood it. I'm not sending Lazarus to warn your brothers because they have already been warned. If they're listening, if they're reading carefully, if they're paying attention, there is a narrative that runs through this book. And I will be the first to admit, as someone who reads this and studies professionally, you can miss it. You can miss it. But that there is a narrative that runs through this book, what Abraham calls Moses and the prophets, the Old Testament, or what we refer to as the Hebrew Bible. There's a narrative thread that runs through this story. That if you're reading carefully, you will get it. And the narrative thread can be summed up, in my opinion, can be summed up in 3 words. God is love. That's the narrative thread. God is love. And if you are reading carefully, you'll get it. You'll understand. The imagery here is not unimportant. Jesus says the rich man's wearing purple. Purple's the color of royalty. It's the color of the king. The king was one of the anointed figures in the nation of Israel. See, if you're reading carefully, you'll know that the role of the king is to take care of his people. It's to provide for them. It's to comfort them, to make sure that they have what they need, to protect them from invaders. Not to allow them to languish in pain and suffering at their doorstep and step over them every day, refusing to do something about it. No king who rightly understands what it means to be a Hebrew king would ever do that. It says he's wearing fine linen. The language for fine linen, it's the same material that was used to construct their worship tabernacle in the desert during their wilderness wanderings, the place where God came to dwell with them, and the same fabric that was used to make the priests' robes. So if you're reading carefully, if you're reading the story carefully, you'll know that the role of the priest is to mediate God's covenant of mercy. The word mercy comes from a Latin word misericordia. Cordia, heart. Miseri, miserable, broken, needy. Mercy means a heart for the broken. If you're reading carefully, if you read the priesthood carefully, you'll know that that's the priest's job, is to mediate God's covenant of mercy to people, right? Which is not what the rich man is doing. The rich man, it says that he's feeding sumptuously. That language is the same language used for when the people of Israel gather for their sacred festivals. And one of the things that was true for when they gathered for their sacred festivals was they were always supposed to involve and invite people like the stranger, the outsider, the widow, the orphan, the needy. The rich man never invites Lazarus into his home, feasts sumptuously right in front of him, and does nothing to attend to his needs. See, what Abraham's trying to say to the rich man is, they don't need any more warning. How much more warning do you need? The warning is already there. If you're reading the story properly, you'll get it. God is love, and therefore, you are to be people. Because you're made in God's image. You are to be people of love, or people of mercy, people who have heart for the needy. Now, this is where this is interesting. Abraham says, the rich man says to Abraham, no, Moses and the prophets is not good enough. Send somebody from beyond the grave. That'll be unavoidable. There's no way they'll reject that. And Abraham says the most interesting thing. He says, yeah, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. People who take faith and use it as a way to serve their own personal sense of well-being can so distort what faith actually is that even if a person were to come to them from beyond the grave, they won't get it. They'll just use that encounter to serve the vision they're already committed to, which is precisely what we do with the resurrection of Jesus. Believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and what? It'll serve your sense of well-being. You'll get something out of it. The whole point of Abraham connecting these ideas of Moses and the prophets with the resurrection is because this narrative thread that is there, if you read it carefully, God is love, should become unavoidably clear in the resurrection. That the wildest thing happened in the first century. That this guy showed up. And he walked around performing miracles. And he claimed to be God's son, which in their world made him somehow equal with God. Would have been very mind-blowing for them to try to get their brains around. That somehow, and this was very conspicuous for first century Jews, they only worshiped one God as it was. And that was a really radical faith view. But when Jesus showed up and lived and died and rose from the dead, what they started to realize was that their radical view of God wasn't radical enough. That God, this one God, is actually somehow a relationship of three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I mean, you can imagine as they're like working this out in their brains how strange an idea this would have been. But what you have to understand, it took them hundreds of years to work this out theologically. What I want you to understand is that it is central, foundational. Our understanding of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is what we mean when we say God is love. When we say God is love, we're not just saying like, well, God's nice to people. We're saying that God's actual nature is a sort of relational self-giving between persons. Persons who are separate or distinguishable from one another, but are not separable. And that's actual theological language from the first century. Here's why this is so important and how it connects to the parable. Abraham connects Moses and the prophets, God is love, this narrative thread, with resurrection. When we see Jesus live and die and rise and ascend, and we start realizing that God is somehow loving relationship between persons, and you are made in God's image. This is how the Christian worldview tells you what it means to be a human person. To be a human person is not to get absorbed up into some impersonal collective. And it is also not to stand separate from the collective as if there is no such thing. That in the same way that God exists in loving relationship between persons that are distinguishable but not separable, what it means to be human person is to be in indissoluble right relationships with other people. That you are human person to the degree that you are living into right relationship with other persons. And I know that that's probably heady and you're going to have to spend some time thinking about that. But what the Christian worldview says is you are a unique individual soul made in the image of God. What it means to be a human person is to be made in the image of God, and God's nature is relational. And so what it means to be the individual person is to be in relationship. That's how you become who you are designed to be in Christ. There's Trinitarian language in this parable. You know how Abraham's referred to as father. Lazarus and the rich man are referred to as sons. The word that's used to describe what Lazarus experiences at Abraham's side is comfort. It's the word that the New Testament uses to refer to the Holy Spirit. So the language, the imagery you get of Abraham with Lazarus is like, this is a picture of right relationship. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. This is, and it's meant to stand in stark contrast to the relationship between the rich man and Lazarus. That you and I, as people who profess faith in Jesus Christ, you are becoming who you are as a human person in the context of right relationships with other people. So there is no such thing as you and I pursuing our own sort of independent wealth, comfort, safety, security, fortune, well-being, irrespective of our relationships with other people. Have you ever heard someone say that? Well, I'm doing what makes me happy. I'm pursuing my own happiness. Even if it means violating relationships with other people, harming people with whom you've pledged bonds of love. See, there's no such thing for the Christian person. That what it means to be me is indissoluble from my relationships with others. Those that I see every single day. So I think some practical implications here. Most of us, if you live out here, it isn't that the Lazaruses of the world don't exist. It's just that we've moved our gates. My gate is so far away from anybody who looks like Lazarus that I just don't have to face that every day. That's something for us to think about. The degree to which, as followers of Jesus Christ, we have a moral, ethical obligation to care for people in need. Because God's fundamental nature is mercy, our fundamental nature is supposed to be mercy. Now, the other side of that is there are people, sort of in a metaphorical or analogical way, that are sitting at your gate every day, who we have just learned not to see. And these could be people in your own home. It could be your spouse. It could be your kids. It could be the guy that lives across the street that you know has no friends and lives alone and is lonely. And you never invite him into your home. You never invite him over. You never invite him to the block party. You never talk to him. So there's a sense in which the Lazaruses of the world are like so far removed from our living context that we just don't see them and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But there's also a sense in which people like Lazarus are right in front of us every single day. And if you're not careful, the sort of individualist value that just washes us over us every day leads us to believe that you and I can live a life that's irrespective of the people around us. That it's possible for me to pursue my own agenda unrelated to the humans who are in my midst or in my near context. The good news of the Christian gospel is that God is love. That God's fundamental nature is mercy, misericordia, heart for the needy. And you and I are needy. We are. We are people of need. Most importantly, we are people who need God. And we have a God who graciously gives God's self to us every single day. Every single day. The sort of goal of the Christian faith is to become like that in the way that we live toward one another. And that has temporal and it has eternal consequences. It has life is eternal. It doesn't end. That how we actually live our lives does matter. What you have done, what you are doing, what you plan to do, it does matter. That there's a God who says, I made you to be a certain way. I love you. That is never going to change. I am going to continue to give myself to you day in and day out as a God of essential mercy, and that is who you are going to become. And until we get that, until you see that, until you start to live in it, I want you to understand that perspective, this is my opinion on the parable, that's the chasm. You know, when Abraham says, look, there's a gulf, man. There's a chasm. We can't come to you and you can't come to us. I don't want you to think of that as a spatial chasm. I want you to think about it as a perspectival, spiritual chasm. That as long as you are in a place where you think that you can pursue your own life irrespective of your relationships, that's a chasm, and it is unbridgeable. And it will stay that way, provided you stay that way. Hopefully, the good news of the Christian gospel that God is love will open your eyes. Right? Pain can be a teacher, but it's not a great one. Hopefully, the good news of the Christian gospel will open your eyes to the reality that God is love, and that's who you are to be, right? Essential in mercy. Okay? So, a couple things for you to think about this week as we kind of get this individualism series going, right? Are you pursuing your personal happiness in a way that requires you to violate a loving relationship with another person? Have you ever found yourself in that place where you think you're pursuing your personal happiness and it doesn't matter, even though it's harming your children or it's harming your spouse or it's harming your family or it's harming somebody else? There's something for you to think about and be honest about, dialogue about. Is there someone sitting at your gate that you've learned not to see? You just have become accustomed to not seeing them. Maybe you don't even want to see them. You just don't want to see them as a person because you don't have to deal with them. Think about it. It could be someone in your house. We're supposed to be people of mercy. We're going to participate in the sacrament of communion this morning. We do this every week here at Waterville.